Welcome to day 20 of our scripture reading and encouragement. Today we're going to cover Exodus 2, 3, and 4, as well as Matthew 16. We'll finish out that chapter with verses 5 through 28. So there's a lot to cover today. I'm going to jump in and go as fast as I can, but I want to be careful not to miss some important things. So we start out in Exodus 2, Moses is born. Now remember, Pharaoh has just made a law, that any Hebrew boy who is born will be killed. So his parents, they realize that he's a special boy. God shows them he's special. So it says his mother and father kept him hidden for 3 months. I want you to think about that. How hard is it to keep a baby hidden for 3 months? A baby is crying. A baby needs 100% attention. But they've managed to keep him hidden for 3 months. And it says that his mother realized she could no longer keep him hidden. So she puts him in a basket. She makes this waterproof basket with pine tar and makes it in reeds and puts it in the reeds of the Nile River. And I want you to just think about this. This mother has had this boy, and she's living under this fear of this Pharaoh his only purpose right now is to kill these Hebrew boys, so this nation doesn't keep, or this group of people doesn't keep growing and getting more powerful. So she's had to keep this baby hidden for 3 months. And then she's desperately putting him in a basket, hoping he'll be found by somebody who will take care of him, an Egyptian, putting him in water, just trying to save his life. And I want you to just think about the despair his mother must have been going through. It's just crazy to stop and think about that. But then God intervenes. Pharaoh's daughter comes along. She finds him, and this baby finds favor with Pharaoh's daughter. The boy's sister had been watching. She comes down and offers help. Do you need a Hebrew woman to nurse this baby? And Pharaoh's daughter says yes. And so now the sister gets to reunite Moses with its mother until he's old enough to be weaned off and adopted by Pharaoh's daughter. And now the mom's got to give up her baby again. I just can't imagine what Moses' mother went through. The Bible doesn't really focus much on her, but the sacrifices she had to make for God's plan to take place through Moses. So Moses grows up. It doesn't tell us a lot, but we know he grows up as a grandchild of Pharaoh, a son to the daughter of Pharaoh. So we know he grows up in prosperity. But then he goes one day to see his Hebrew people, and he sees an Egyptian beating one of the Hebrews, treating him harshly, and Moses kills him and drags him off. Well, pretty quickly word gets out. Pharaoh tries to kill Moses. Moses flees. And it says years pass. So Moses flees. He finds a shepherd. He helps the shepherd's daughters, fights off shepherds who are harassing them. He ends up settling in that home, marrying, having children. And it says years passed, and the evil Pharaoh has died. The Israelites, in the meantime, have cried out to God for help. And it said that God remembered his promise, the promise he'd made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and he knew it was time to react. Time to act on their behalf, because they had cried out to them. And that's my first encouragement out of this, is things are not going their way. Things are not going the way they probably had planned. Things are very harsh, but they continue to cry out to God in their time of suffering and despair, and he heard them. So guys, if you're suffering, if you're going through a tough time, continue to cry out to God. He will hear your prayers, and he will answer them. So it tells us Moses is tending his flock. He's ventured over to Mount Sinai, which is the mountain of God. And then the Lord appears to him in a blazing fire in a bush. And this is a famous story we call Moses and the burning bush. And Moses is amazed because this bush is on fire, but it doesn't burn up. And God begins to speak to him, and it terrifies Moses. But he says, it's time to lead my people out of slavery to a fertile land, a land flowing with milk and honey. And you're the man to do it, Moses. And immediately Moses protests. Who am I? And I want you to stop and think about that. How many times do we argue? I know I have. How many times do we argue? God, are you sure you want me to do that? Who am I? And that's how Moses, one of the most important men in the Old Testament, that leads an entire nation out of out of Egypt, ultimately to what becomes Israel, to the promised land. And he starts out his conversation with God was, who am I? You see humility there. That's one good thing, but you also see him begin to question God and doubt that he is the right person. Who am I? God's like, you don't worry about that. You tell him I sent you. Okay, what's your name? And I love this scripture. He says, I am who I am. I don't think we fully have a translation to understand what God said to him. I am. I am who I am. He later says, tell them Yahweh sent you. And this is where we get these names of God. And there's some songs out there like The Great I Am. I sing that song with all my heart because we don't understand the power of that name, I am. He is the great I am. He is Yahweh, the God, the creator. Oh, it's just, those names fire me up. So God tells him, I'm going to send you with miracles. I'm gonna give you the staff. It's gonna turn into a snake. Your hand's gonna turn to leprosy and then back to healed. And what does Moses do? He questions again. So he gives him the miracles. Then Moses says, I'm not good with words. This is Moses' fourth objection. I'm not good with words. I get tongue-tied. And he says, send someone else. God, I'm not the right guy. Send someone else. So God has shown him and talked to him. He's in this burning bush. He's showing him these miracles. And Moses still doesn't think he's the right guy. And it says God gets angry at this point. And he tells Moses that he'll send Aaron to help. But then God tells Moses, I'm going to send you with these miracles, but it's not going to be easy. I'm actually going to harden the heart of Pharaoh. And that's hard to understand. But we don't always understand what God is doing. And I think if we look at the story, Egypt had become the most powerful nation and they had so much wealth. And God knew that he would have to harden the heart of Pharaoh, and this would have to be a tough exit for the Israelites or for the Hebrew nation to be let go and for them to gain the wealth of those Egyptians so they would be able to survive out in the wilderness. So then there's an interesting twist to the story. Moses hasn't been completely obedient in his Hebrew ways, I guess you would say, and he hadn't circumcised his son. They're on their way back to Egypt, and it almost cost him his life. God is showing up, and he's gonna kill Moses. Even though he's chosen Moses, Moses hasn't obeyed him. Moses' wife circumcises their son, and everything is good. And this may look like a little weird twist of the story, but God needs our obedience. Sorry. And we see this character of Moses. He was stubborn, but he was chosen by God. He was not perfect, but he was chosen by God. At times he lacked faith, but he was chosen by God. So I want you to be encouraged if you've ever questioned, God, why are you sending me? I'm not good enough. I can't do the things you're asking me to do. Be encouraged that Moses was the same way. And really, we've seen that through the Bible, through the characters that have come up. We haven't seen perfect people. We've seen very imperfect people with normal human flaws, chosen by God because God's glory can shine through a very imperfect person. So I want you to be encouraged by that. If you're not perfect and you're not good enough for God, that's exactly who he wants to choose to do his work. So be encouraged by that. All right, we're going to jump over to Matthew. Jesus is immediately warning his disciples about the yeast of the Pharisees and Sadducees. What he means by that is a little yeast affects the entire thing. So he's saying these guys are religious. They don't understand who I am. And if you allow a little bit of that yeast to come in, it's going to ruin the whole batch. And I think that we have to be careful and look at this for our time today, because there are very religious people that can sneak into our environments. And they say they're following Jesus, but they're so religious. They're works-based. They're not grace-based. Or they're trying to make everything perfect. And I think Jesus is warning the disciples at that time, and he's warning us as well. We have to be careful not to let that religious spirit come into our environment. And then Jesus begins to ask him, who do you say I am? Who do the people say I am? Who do you say I am? And Peter answers, you are the Son of God. You're the Messiah. And Jesus says, God has revealed that to you. Only God could reveal that to you. Man could not. Only God could. And Jesus changed his name to Peter, the Rock. We saw that back in the Old Testament when there was a major change from Abram to Abraham. That having a name change was very important in those times because it signified a change in your life. And this was a change from Simon. We're calling him Peter even up to this point, but he's really Simon. That's when his name gets changed to Peter, the Rock. Then Jesus begins to prophesy his death. I have to die. And they didn't understand that. And Peter actually reprimands Jesus and says, surely you won't die. And Jesus says, get away from me, Satan. I want you to see this. In verse 18, Peter is the rock. In verse 23, Peter is acting like Satan and being called, Satan, get away from me. And I think we can be encouraged there too, that once again, we see a very imperfect person. Peter is willing to step forth and be bold. He's willing to walk on water. But then he wasn't a perfect human. He turned his eyes off Jesus, he began to sink. We saw that earlier. And now we see this where he recognizes that Jesus is the Son of God, but he's still trying to put his human mind around this won't work if you die. So be encouraged if you're not always perfect. We want to remain as faithful as possible. And I want to use these stories to grow my faith, but I don't want to get down and get too beat up if I do struggle in my faith. I just look at these mighty men of God and get encouraged that I can come back out of this with God's help because he's bigger than my lack of faith. Then Jesus says, to be my follower, you must take up your cross. I want you to think about that for a minute. That was a death torture weapon. Take up your cross. That would be like us saying, take up your electric chair. Take up your lethal injection. Take up the method of torture that's going to kill you. Wow, that's a good sales pitch. Jesus is really saying, give up your selfishness. You have to give up your selfishness and your worldly ways and what you understand if you want to save your soul. So guys, I know this one's been a little long, but there's been a lot packed into this one. If you're having a rough time, I want you to be encouraged that life wasn't easy for these men in the Bible, for these characters in the Bible, for these people. Look at what Moses' mother had to go through. Look what Moses had to go through. We've already talked about all these other characters that went through rough times. Now look what Peter's going through. He's got faith, but then he's chastised. Jesus is telling all of his disciples, you're going to have to suffer for me. So being a Christian doesn't mean everything's going to be perfect. It doesn't mean everything's going to be easy. But I hope you're encouraged by these stories, because if you're going through a rough patch right now, a rough time, be encouraged that that's exactly the path you may need to be on to glorify God and to serve him for his purpose. Nothing was easy for these people, and it may not be easy for us. I hope you're encouraged today, and I hope you have a great day.